So we're moving over to the Indian subcontinent. I'll be speaking about alchemy in India, on the Indian subcontinent, so not the modern nation of India. And I'm going to start my talk by showing you an image that connects alchemical cultures across Eurasia. I don't know if you can see this. This is an image, this is an 18th century painting, a Mughal painting. It's from a collection of Mughal images from the British Library that depicts a young woman luring mercury out of a well. There are quite a few similar pictures of the same theme in collections of Mughal paintings. We've got a different one, for example, in our volume. So this was obviously a very well-known story, a well-known theme in Mughal times in India. This image is based on a story that we find in Indian alchemical literature about the harvesting of its most important ingredient, alchemical ingredient, namely mercury. However, this story is also found in the Syriac version of an alchemical work by Zosimus, which is dated to the, Salam, correct me please, 4th or 5th century, possibly. We also have another version of this story in Chinese sources. And in the Chinese sources, the story is a bit more similar to the Syriac version. It's not so much that it's a young woman, but it's that somebody wearing gold and the mercury is trying to unite with the gold. But this Chinese story sets the well in which mercury comes out into probably the Syrian region as well. So this is an alchemical story that made its way across the Silk Road, linking traditions with each other, and also, being out there in the public imagination. So we often think of alchemy as something that is esoteric, that only a few initiated people know about, but clearly there are some topics that sort of made it out into the broader public and into a wide geographical area as well. Coming back to India, when we speak of Indic alchemy or Indian alchemy, there's actually several historical disciplines that developed on the Indian subcontinent that could be understood as alchemical traditions in the sense that they deal with the transmutation of matter. The first is called the doctrine of elements, and that's dhātu, vāda in Sanskrit. And this is associated with the making of gold, but usually we're talking about sort of miracle stories here with this discipline. And there's no literature associated with it, so we just get mentions of this in various Indian narrative literatures. The second is called the doctrine of mercury. And the word here is Rasa vāda, and I'll be talking more about this, so I won't just here now. But this one is focused on the making and application of mercurial elixirs for the transmutation of metals and then the human body. The third is the South Indian Tamil Siddha tradition, which combines yogic with alchemical and medical thought, using both mercury and other substances, especially salts, as agents of transmutation. So the entire literature of this tradition is written in Tamil rather than in Sanskrit, as the tradition that I will be talking about is. There's also a mention of a tradition called lohā vāda. So vāda means doctrine, lohā means metal, but it's sort of metals and minerals. The focus there is on iron and not on mercury. And then finally, the Indian tradition, the Sanskritic Indian tradition, got transmitted to Tibet, with several Sanskrit alchemical works being translated into Tibetan and then integrated into the Tibetan Buddhist canon. So in the Indian context, usually we have a Hindu religious context, but it got brought into the Tibetan Buddhist context. And there it's referred to as Chulen and also as Rasayana. So in the 10th century of the Common Era, alchemists in India began to compose works in Sanskrit about their craft, defining both its goals and the methods with which to achieve them. This new genre of literature set practices that were previously the stuff of legend, miracle stories, and so on, within a framework of an authoritative discipline with formal boundaries. The practitioners of this discipline considered goals such as making gold, lengthening lifespan, attaining superhuman powers, and entering transcendent states achievable through technical means, and especially through a curated use of enhanced substances, mercury in particular. So Indian alchemists developed a set of procedures they believed would transform inorganic and organic materials into substances with the power to transmute base metals to noble ones and ordinary humans into perfected beings. At the same time, alchemical products could also be applied in this worldly ways, such as in the treatment of disease or to counter age-related conditions, forming a subdiscipline of iatrochemistry, chemical medicine, that over time became the dominant feature of Indian alchemy. So there are various names for the alchemical tradition, and all of them highlight the centrality of rasa. You can always see these Sanskrit words, rasa śāstra, rasa vidya, rasa vāda, and so on. So rasa means mercury, can also have other meanings like liquid and juice and so on, but in the context of alchemical literature, it almost always means mercury. And then the other word, śāstra, is a discipline, vidya is the knowledge or the science, vāda is the doctrine, and so on. The last word, the rasayana, is actually not used by alchemical practitioners to describe the entirety of their discipline, but rather it was one stage of the use of the elixir, but it's a word that has been used by outsiders looking in on the tradition. For example, al-Biruni, describing the tradition, and it's sort of caught on. So now you will find people referring to Indian alchemy as rasayana. What may come as a surprise to many is that this is a living tradition. So parts of it, at least, survive as its pharmacology, basically, survive as a subdivision of Ayurveda. So that's classical Indian medicine, one of several forms of indigenous medicines in India. And the education and practice of this medicine, of Ayurveda, are regulated through the Ministry of Ayush in India. And when it's sort of this regulated kind of medicine, it's called, so this Indian alchemy as part of Indian medicine is called Rasa śāstra. A number of universities in India with Ayurveda departments have a subdivision for Rasa śāstra, and there's also some Ayurveda colleges with courses in Rasa śāstra. So that's typically pharmacology, right? How to make particular kinds of medicines. Rasa śāstra is one of several subjects in the curriculum for attaining the degree of Bachelor of Ayurvedic Medicine and Surgery, the BAMS. It's also an area of specialization for graduate studies. When you got a BAMS, you can work in hospitals, for example. You're part of India's national public health care setup. So we have biomedicine, but we also have Ayurveda, and then as a subdivision, we have Rasa śāstra. Rasa śāstra formulations are used extensively by Indian pharmaceutical companies, and this is very important for the Indian economy, actually. So this is an example of one of these kinds of medicines. It's an over-the-counter project called Makradvaj. This is a mercury sulfide formulation, and it's used as a general tonic for strength and well-being. So you could kind of take this as you would take maybe magnesium or iron or so. So it's a very easily available. Most companies have some version of it, but yes, it's made of mercury and sulfur and then some other ingredients as well, gold, for example. So lots of pharmaceutical companies make their version of it, but the original recipe is found 800 years ago in one of the Sanskrit alchemical works, and then in other variations in some of the Ayurvedic, so in the medical works. And this brings us to the literature. This picture has nothing to do with literature, I just like it. There was a museum in Delhi that had a sort of exhibition on the Indian laboratory. But coming to the literature, there's quite a large body of Sanskrit alchemical works. And I've listed just a few of the most important ones here. There are really dozens of them. And you can see that they range from the 10th century to the 16th century. We're actually guessing around a little bit when it comes to the 10th century. It might be 1 or 2 centuries earlier. So then you see a gap after the 16th century where no Sanskrit works are written. Instead, there are some works produced in the vernaculars and in Persian. And then, however, by the 19th century, we see a renaissance in the production of Sanskrit alchemical works, and that goes into the 20th century. We have access to some print editions of these works, and there are even a few partial translations, like this is one of them, of a 16th century work called the Rasa Ratna Samuchaya. And so that translates about half of this into English. There are translations into other Indian vernaculars because it's used for training purposes. So if you learn about Rasa śāstra at a university, you will probably have a translation into an Indian vernacular rather than the Sanskrit original. But the bulk of the works is still only available in manuscripts. So here is one such manuscript of a work that we're not totally sure what the date is, called the Rasa Mangala, the benediction of the Lord of Essences, or the benediction of Mercury. And this one is unusual in that it has images of apparatuses for the sublimation of mercury and so on. So this is very unusual. Most alchemical manuscripts from India contain no imagery whatsoever. It's all just text. So having some pictures, there's only, to my knowledge, 3 different alchemical works that have these kinds of images. Most alchemical works are transmitted in very few copies. So here you can see where copies of 2 works are found in South Asia. There are some alchemical manuscripts in Europe, also in the US. So here just 2. The Sarnava is the second oldest, it's probably 11th century, maybe 12th. And here one again, the Rasaratna Samuchaya, that was the 16th century. And you can see that there's loads more manuscripts of the Rasaratna Samuchaya. And my general impression is that alchemical works with medical content had more copies than ones that didn't. But the ones that get the most copies, so some we only have like 2 or 3 copies, and some we have over 400. And the things that get disseminated most are actually the parts that have sort of magical diagrams and so on in them. So magic seems to have been the most popular topic, and then after that, medicine. So if you want to get a taste of the literature, I would invite you to go to my project's website at ayuryog.org, Alchemy Timeline. There's an interactive timeline where you can just have a look at sort of the various works that were produced. We give summaries of each of the works and just a little taste with a translation and some pictures for these works. We don't have time to have a look at this now, but in your own time maybe. But what is in these actual works? And you know, here I'm sort of in the esoterica panel, but my general impression of Indian alchemical literature is that it's actually very technical. Most of the works describe a series of alchemical operations called Saṃskāra in Sanskrit for the purification and perfection of mercury and accompanying materials for making an elixir. The operations consist of mixing, grinding, roasting, subliming, distilling, and calcining materials. You know, what did an alchemist do with his time? He spent time grinding things in a mortar. That was sort of most of his day would have been spent doing that. The resulting elixir is then used to transmute metals, and if that works, it can then be applied to the human to transform the human, to make a superhuman. As in metals, thus in the body. It's a little bit reminiscent of Hermes Trismegistus' is an as above, so below, but here it's as in metals, thus in the body. And this quote just means if you apply the elixir to the metal and you can make gold, then the elixir is ready to transform the human. Describing these procedures also involves laying out the technology for the processing of materials, and this involves giving a system of weights and measures, describing whatever is needed in the laboratory, such as instruments, apparatuses, materials. And along with that, we get a categorization of materials based on how they interact with each other, and especially with mercury. So we have categorizations of materials before, especially in medical literature. Now in alchemy, it's about what happens if you mix this with mercury, for example, and then you heat them and so on. The final shared element is the idea of transmutation. When the elixir is applied to the human, different outcomes are expected, and these range from bodily liberation. This is in a Hindu context where we have the idea of a cycle of rebirths, right? And so you get out of this bodily liberation, you get this by becoming immortal. You can also experience godhood, special powers, and then you also get more mundane medical concerns. If you've got a cough, you can treat it with this mercurial elixir. Now, although most works are dedicated to the technical and practical work of alchemy, most alchemical works also contain religious elements, such as presenting mercury and sulfur, the real substances, or mica, as manifestations of the divine. Mercury is understood to be the essence of the absolute in the form of the god, the Hindu god Śiva, and thus can be worshipped as this deity. The alchemical path is then presented as a preeminent form of religious and spiritual practice, and it's not so much in the making of the elixir, so in the practice of alchemy, but in the taking of the elixir, as the practitioner then becomes equal to Śiva or has the realization of the absolute. The worship and use of mercury are both seen as a kind of highway to spiritual realization. Some works detail tantric forms of worship and initiation processes, and they use mantras, so speech acts of power, and maṇḍalas, which are magic diagrams, as part of alchemical practice. And this is especially relevant in the context of the setup of the laboratory and in the initiation of the alchemical practitioner. And the image here shows the use of diagrams in alchemical medicine. This is for treating a sort of a skin disease. There are also other topics, and so I am wrapping up here. So 2 works describe a kind of alchemical pilgrimage, for example, to Sri Shailam, which is an area in South India, where the pilgrim experiences encounters with divine beings and digs for treasure. There are whole chapters on magic. We're talking curses, warding off bad luck, causing bad luck, love potions, amulets, and so on. And there are many medical aspects ranging from the use of elixirs for rejuvenation or longevity, aphrodisiacs again, and fertility treatments. But later works become more and more medical, and then what was an elixir before becomes reinterpreted as a medicine used to treat various diseases, and many new formulations using the older methods of preparation are added. The heart of the discipline lies in the idea of transmutation, of perfecting materials, and even the human being with a substance so powerful that it equates with the divine, but that also must undergo complicated procedures of purification and perfection. And I'll end here.
Thank you.
We didn't have time, but we made some videos of reconstructions of some of the recipes. You can find them on the Ayurveda website and also on YouTube. Here we were sort of purifying mercury, and there we made coral. So.
And all this is based on Sanskrit recipes, is that so?
That's right, yes.
That haven't been changed at all throughout the years?
No, they do get changed. So from alchemical work to alchemical work, you sometimes have added materials, sometimes materials are substituted. There we get an idea that maybe there are regional differences of what was available, but the basic idea of what you do with mercury and then sulfur or mica, that remains.
Mercury sounds quite dangerous in medicine. I wouldn't digest mercury.
You probably have. Do you have, crowns on your teeth? So,
yeah,
that's a mercury amalgam. Then, in vaccines, you have a form of mercury as a preservative. Mercurochrome used to be widely available as a disinfectant. So I think there's more mercury even in Western medicine than you might think. But yes, of course, it is a toxic material, and one should be very careful with it.
Thank you.